Well, that was awesome. We can go home now, I guess. Good enough. Okay, so today we finish up this series on Cruciform. And just to bring you back from the very beginning, the very first week, I talked about where the idea of crucifying and sacrifice came from originally. And what I wanted to submit to you just weeks ago was that I don't think that sacrifice itself was ever God's idea. I think it was humans' idea. I think we wanted to do something to, because of our history and all that, to do something, to know that we did something in relationship with God that God would use to somehow forgive us. And I think because God is interested in communicating with us like a parent would with an infant, God is going to use the language of people to accommodate that. And for centuries and centuries and centuries, that language was sacrifice. Like a baby, you're not going to send a baby a Hallmark card. You're going to cuddle the baby. You're going to woo the baby. You're going to sing sweet songs to the baby because that's the language that the baby understands. And if you think that, equating a baby talk with something as deep and profound as sacrifice is inappropriate, well, the Bible itself actually does that. Paul does it, and then the writer of Hebrews also does it, where they talk about being stuck on the idea of sacrifice solely as, okay, now I'm forgiven. Oh, wait, I forgot. Now I'm forgiven. All on sacrifice. And they said, you know what? That's like you're on the breast. You're still drinking milk when you should be eating solid food. In other words, Paul and company wanted us to move beyond it, wanted to recognize it for what it is, but to move beyond it because the point has never been about sacrifice, which is tough for us to hear in the Christian tradition because we have put so much emphasis on the cross and on sacrifice as the forgiveness of sin. And when I was 13 years old, that did not make sense to me because I knew enough about the Bible growing up in church that I knew that God really wasn't about human sacrifice. In fact, that was part of the point of Abraham being called to sacrifice Isaac, was to say, we're never ever going to do that again. And just this whole idea of recognizing a God somehow up there being appeased by, the smoke of sacrifice bowls and turtle doves and whatever else was somehow going to work, that did not make sense to me. Didn't make sense for the character of God. So I even asked my sister, who was in seminary at the time, preparing for ministry eventually, and I said, this does not add up. And she tried her best to explain it logically, and the logic's not the problem. I can get it logically, but what I'm trying to communicate, and I think a lot of folks I've talked to here and elsewhere, is that there's a reason there's a disconnect. And that's because we don't live in a sacrificial culture anymore. We don't think that way. This is not to in any way cast it aside or to minimize it, because you can't read the scriptures without running into sacrifice. You need to understand it. You need to understand it in its original context. But get the point. Get the point of Paul, who's saying, okay, there it is, but the point is something other than the cross. The cross was the means to an end, not the end itself. And I think we've struggled to remember that. Because the point of the cross, the point of everything about God, in fact, is about getting to Easter. This, by the way, I know you're excited because you know I'm an amazing artist. So here we are. This is Pete's rendition of The Empty Tomb. Oop, that's the dud. This is an empty tomb, which is what Easter is all about. So back in the day, on the side of a hill, a hole would be, a cave would be hewn out of the rock, and a person's body would be put in, and then for a period of time, depending on the time of season actually, a huge rock would be rolled over the entrance of the tomb. That would do a couple things. One, for sanitation, because that was all they had to work with, and you needed time for the body to do its thing, but also for grave robbers and stuff. And this huge stone that would go across this thing would weigh several hundred pounds. I mean, that's just the way that it was. But the point of Easter was that when they went just a few days later to prepare Jesus' body for that burial, and after, the stone would be there, and then he'd be there for a while, they went and found that the stone had been rolled away already, and that there was no body in there. And what they quickly discovered was this: that resurrection had taken place. And this resurrection of Jesus, which is what Easter is all about, is what I'm telling you, is what everything is all about. That's what God is all about. From the very beginning of creation, God has been about life and the renewal of life. This is the song of God from cover to cover in the Bible and every life since. This is the very nature of God. Not the idea of a God up there keeping a clipboard of trying to figure out who's in, who's out, and whatnot. Keeping tabs that way. The point of the very presence and Spirit of God is the renewal of all things, the restoration of all things. And so the disciples saw the cross of Christ as a final sacrifice. They say, no more, because of things that I unpacked with you a few weeks ago. They said, we're not even going to think about sacrifice anymore, so let's stop thinking about sacrifice, is what the disciples realized. Because what God has always been about is about Easter. It's always been about getting to Easter. It's always been about getting to Easter. When Easter happened, when the resurrection happened, an amazing shift took place with the disciples. If you remember, on that Friday when Jesus died, the disciples fled. They ran for cover. And the reason they ran for cover is they were pretty sure that they were next. And they knew if they could be found by the temple police or the religious leaders or Roman authorities, there's good odds that there were many crosses left for them to be placed on. Because remember, it's not like Jesus' cross was one of very few in history. That's not it. Jesus was crucified on that particular day because that was his appointment. There may have been 10 others crucified before and 12 others crucified after. Rome was famous for using crucifixion as torture, death, embarrassment, humiliation, and as a sign that you'd better not cross Rome. They crucified people by the hundreds and thousands. Jesus was just another one of those people who got killed on a cross. So, of course, they're going to cower. And they hung out together. They huddled together, wondering if they were going to be next until that Sunday morning, that Easter morning, when they got a report back, first from women, that something had happened, that Jesus' body wasn't there, and they heard this, they got this vision from an angel that he had risen from the grave, and there are different stories all kind of trying to say the same thing from different angles, and they all kind of work together in their own way, trying to make a different kind of statement. But the point is, as soon as they realized that the cross wasn't the end of the story, that Easter is where it was all going to, that God was always about getting to Easter, which is all about resurrection, that changed everything. They came out of hiding. All of a sudden they were bold in the streets, out in the open in Jerusalem. They had all kinds of mission vigor about them, unafraid to go anywhere and to break traditions everywhere, because they knew that the point wasn't about keeping laws anymore. It was all about being involved in getting to Easter. It was all about the renewal of all things, the restoration of all things, which is what resurrection is really about. You had a guy that was beaten to a pulp beyond recognition, and yet when Easter Day came, he wasn't recognizable again because he was so renewed. That's the resurrection of all things. That is the renewal. That is what we're hoping for. God has always been about getting to Easter. On that day, as a text in Isaiah says, like the next screen, let's check it out. This text, this quote from Isaiah 63, starts with the very first text that Jesus spoke from in his hometown. It's going to sound familiar. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted, and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it, the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, He will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. So there's a reversal here. There's a restoration. Whereas once before, they were filled with ashes on their head and mourning. Now He's exchanging beauty for ashes, strength for fear, gladness for mourning, and peace for despair. This is what it's always about. This is what happens when Easter shows up. Now you may be thinking, somebody should tell Pete that it's not Easter Sunday yet. We're a whole week away from Easter. But what you need to know is that we got to talk about this phenomenon today to clean up Cruciform before we can get to next week. So on the next slide, just to kind of give you a recap on the first thing, go ahead and click it again, Trudy. Hopefully something might come up. There it is. God has always been about getting to Easter. But the next thing that comes up is this, that to get to Easter, it's always going to come with a choice. So go ahead and stop right there. Getting to Easter always comes with a choice and a stretch. So we want to get here. We want to get to empty tomb. And that is going to require from us a choice. A choice to be a part of it or not. A choice to recognize that it's even possible or not. A choice to pursue it or not. And you know, it is a choice. And recovery, they always say it begins with a choice. I want to recover. I want to get better. It always begins with a choice. I want something different. And you know, that's a point where a lot of people stop immediately because they don't really want it. They're pretty comfortable as is. I mean, honestly, here in our country, the kinds of things that we really want in our life compared to other parts of the world, you know, they might be kind of big global kinds of things, and not to minimize any struggle that we go through, but the choices that we have because of our level of comfort are just of a whole different strata from other parts of the world. So for you and I, it's, gosh, I hope there's not a long line at Heritage Eats today, because I'm really looking forward to, you know, some of that pulled pork or whatever. Whereas halfway around the world in northern Kenya, Somalia, this is my 20th day without food. And I don't think my child is going to make it tomorrow. A whole different kind of choice. Or if you're in Syria and you just lost family members because of a gas bomb, and now it's getting worse because there's been retaliation against that, and you don't know if you're going to get out of it alive. It's a whole different thing. Or in our own country with the different kinds of inequality that still exists in reality, even if on the book says we're supposed to be the same and equal. It's very different. But it all begins with a choice. Do we want Easter? Do we want resurrection? Do we want the renewed thing, or are we okay just as we are? It's always a choice. But along with that comes a stretch. Every time, and this is the principle I want you to get today, if nothing else. First, is that God is always about Easter. God is always about getting to Easter. And that every time we pursue resurrection, every time we do that, it's going to come with a choice, and that choice is going to lead to a stretch. All the time, everywhere, in every sector. Anytime we pursue renewal, resurrection of any kind, it's going to require choice, and it's going to require a stretch. And those two things combined are going to feel a lot like a cross. Because here's the thing. We cannot get to Easter apart from going through the cross of a choice and a stretch. You cannot get to the renewal that you want, that you long for, whatever Easter represents to you right now. Whatever you hope will be renewed, whatever death space in your life that you want to see miraculously turned upside down, whatever thing you want fixed, you're not going to get there beyond a choice and a stretch. Rachel's FaceTiming this for all to see right now, so this is not part of my sermon. This is no gimmick. So you keep on going and do your thing. It's always going to come with a choice and a stretch. So just out of curiosity, when we were asked if you waved a magic wand, what kind of things would you want to happen? Call it out. What kind of stuff did you say? Make your husband better? Did I hear that? Physically? Okay, very good. Among other things, right? No, not among other things, just physically. Okay. Your husband's a good guy. You're right. What else? Peace. Yeah, world peace. What else? What's that? Change your health. Yep. What else? Yeah. That this church here would remain forever. I like the sound of that. That's good. No child hunger. Yeah. Yep. What else? Honestly, weren't some of you just saying, I hope the rain is done? Let's get to summer. I mean, that's for you, that's Easter. That one may not, well, that does still require a stretch and a choice. But let me just unpack this on a very personal level, an intrapersonal level, and then a broader level. First, on the intrapersonal level. Let's say for me, my ongoing battle of health and balanced eating and all that stuff, which it's fun to watch me, isn't it? Up and down, here we go. And so if for me, it's, okay, I want to get in better shape. I want to be in a healthier spot. I want to be able to say no to cookies and more to kale, whatever the case is. Well, if my desire for Easter or resurrection is renewed health or better health or whatever, that is a choice. And it's a choice that I have to make that's going to call me to a stretch. The choice is, all right, I'm going to choose healthier options for my life. That stretch for me is, I'm going to stretch past the cookie jar to the salad bin, or to the radishes or whatever it is in my refrigerator. That might seem small, but get the point. You're never going to get to resurrection beyond a choice and a stretch. And maybe it's deeper than that. Maybe for me, maybe it has more to do with other stuff going on, that I'm using food to heal. Maybe I've got some work to do in the interior. And the reason I enjoy a pizza at a time or whatever is because it makes me feel better. And maybe that's a signal that there's more going on that I might want to address. And in fact, that maybe I'll never really get to that healthy place, that resurrection, that Easter, until I actually do the hard work inside. I mean, you talk to anybody in addiction, they know exactly what I'm talking about here. Because addiction doesn't just happen. We get hooked on things because we've had to medicate ourselves because of pain that's going on in our lives or whatever, and then it becomes a chemical thing and it's a big mess. But until we deal with what is really happening, we're stuck. And it starts with a choice, and it leads to a stretch that is difficult. It's hard. It feels like we're picking up a cross, because at times it's excruciating. Or how about a relationship that's in trouble? It could be you and an intimate partner. It could be you and a sibling. It could be you and your kid, you and your parents maybe, you and a good friend, maybe you and a coworker, whatever. And so right here today, maybe that's the thing on your radar, and you're like, man, I would just do anything for that relationship to be better. If that could just be the Easter that I'm looking for. I just want that relationship to be healthy and whole. Okay, so you want resurrection? Well, guess what? That's going to come with a choice and a stretch. Always. The choice is, I actually do want that relationship better. And because I'm saying I want that relationship better, that opens up the door to a stretch. Let's say it's for me and my wife. Now, my wife and I get along great. We're going to celebrate 25 years in another month, which is awesome. But let's say we're in a rough patch. And as we're going forward, if I say, all right, I want my marriage to be in a healthier place, that's my choice, is yes, I guarantee you it's going to stretch me in a handful of ways. First thing it's going to stretch me toward is physically. Because it's going to mean that my calendar and the way that I spend my time and my energy has to change. Because there's a reason relationships start to turn south. And sometimes it's because we don't give the relationship the energy it requires. It's going to stretch me emotionally. Maybe there are things that I've done because I'm an idiot at times, and I've hurt Lynn's feelings or whatever, and I know that emotionally I need to figure out what happened to cause me to be an idiot, and how am I going to help bring grace into the equation. That's a stretch emotionally. It's meaning going against pride. You're going to be stretched. You want any form of Easter, it's going to require a choice and a stretch. We want peace in the world. That's a choice that's going to have a stretch. If we want short peace in the world, it means we play by the world's rules. And because we got the biggest military on the planet, we can win the game for the short term. But if we actually want long-term, comprehensive peace or work toward that, that's a different choice and a much bigger stretch that's hard for us to get to. And at times it will feel like a cross to bear. But that's exactly what Jesus did. That's who he was. That's why he got to Easter. You can't get to resurrection apart from the cross, which is a choice and a stretch. And why don't people just do this? Okay, so you're welcome. Now that you know this, you can go on your merry way and everything's going to be fantastic. Well, no, it's not. This isn't just a theological thing. It's not just something I'm making up. You go into the study of adult transformation and how people actually make massive shifts in their paradigms and their state of being and their life. I mean, really massive shifts. Comes with a choice, and it comes with a stretch. And they might make the choice, but the stretch, the new way of living, what is required to get to that new space is so challenging that they just give up. And they forget they ever made the choice in the first place. Resurrection is hard work. In fact, there's another component here, which is a spiritual component. If I want my marriage to be better, if I want the world to be better, if I want my relationship with food to be better, I'm not going to be able to do it on my own strength. It requires help from the one who is always getting to Easter, the one whose spirit is always flowing toward the renewal and restoration of all things. So I call on God. And if you go to any 12-step group, they are going to say out loud, I recognize that I was powerless against this. I could not do this on my own. I require the help of another. And so do I. And so do you. And so does anybody who is after resurrection. Because the choice might be easy enough to say yes to, but the stretch that we're going to have to bear is very, very difficult. So, as I mentioned here on the screen, the choice and the stretch to join God in pursuit of Easter leads to a very different way to life, marked by the following things that we can see. All through Jesus' ministry, these things show up. We see at times, in fact, I'll show you a really amazing time in a moment, we see Jesus throughout his life. And by the way, if you think about the Gospel of John, and some of this is going to sound real familiar to you because this is all about our belief statement here as a church, which is crafted out of the Gospel of John. The end of the Gospel of John has disciples completely renewed and ready to go to take on the world because of the resurrection. They've seen renewal. That's the end of the story. But at the very beginning of the story, you have Jesus choosing to take on this path, and that caused a stretch in him and anybody else who would choose to follow. For the rest of John, between that moment of stretching and the final moment where you start to see Easter take place or heading toward that, you see Jesus doing all manner of things. You see him kneeling. You see him gracing. When he's kneeling, he's serving people. When you see grace, he's offering forgiveness. Later on, you see him connecting with God. Multiple times he was known for connecting with God, and in really inconceivable ways, he was also incarnate in strange places. So he knelt in service, feeding people, healing people. He offered forgiveness to people who didn't think they were allowed to be forgiven. These things were part of his stretching. These things do not come easily on the serving. Our normal nature is, I'm going to get what I can and hold on to it as hard as I can because it's mine. I'm not going to help you. You help yourself. You pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's the American way. But what if that person doesn't own a pair of boots? Then what? What do you do next? Maybe it's not the American way for everybody. Maybe it's not as easy for everybody. And Jesus understood this in his culture, which was a much more challenging culture than ours. And he recognizes for some of these people to have any hope at all, it's going to require him to kneel in service. Other people were so tormented by their past and what was going on, or they were tormented by what people were saying about their lives, that they were absolutely stuck. And when he came with grace and forgiveness, speaking value into their lives, they actually believed it. And they became renewed themselves and became new people right before their eyes. Jesus was known for connecting. I'm going to show you a real dramatic way on this. But he would break away all by himself. There'd be a huge crowd. He'd have his own little mega church right there, just loving everything. And he'd break away from that because he needed to recharge with God, needed to reconnect. And this one is the one that blows my mind the most. He chose to be incarnate. You know, we often think about this in an isolated way, of Jesus was incarnate, that somehow God was so entwined with him that we see God incarnate in Jesus. But I think there's a bigger principle at work here. And that is because you and I are disciples of God, because the same Spirit flows through us, that when I choose to come alongside somebody in particularly deep ways, that actually the Spirit of God is incarnated in that experience. So if Carrie Nuccio is going through hell for whatever reason, and because she's a friend, and I come alongside her, and I choose to be with her in her pain and torment, I think God shows up in those moments. That's an act of incarnation. Let's say Brian over here hates my guts, which he told me just 2 weeks ago. So we're working on that, right? All right, so let's say Brian hates my guts and is saying terrible things about me behind my back and spreading all kinds of rumors and this kind of a thing. And I know that, but I value Brian as a friend and as a brother. And so I choose to come alongside Brian and say, dude, I know you hate me, but let's work this thing out. Let's talk this thing through. That's an act of incarnation, even coming alongside people who can't stand you. Jesus did this with Judas. He did it with Peter, with them at the same table, breaking bread with them. Now let's say Ruth Vigneault here. Let's say she is just high on life because God has been so good to her, and I think if you asked Ruth, has God been good to you, Ruth? I've got a real strong suspicion she's going to say, yes, God has been very good to me. Is that right, Ruth? Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. That would have been a real bummer if you'd said no. But she said yes, so let's keep going. So if she's just high on life about how God has been faithful and true in her life, it takes nothing away from me or where I'm at to join Ruth in her celebration of what's going on in her life. That's just part of it. These things coming alongside in a close way, allowing the presence of God to come in surprising ways. That's what this is all about. Allowing the Spirit to come into the human experience everywhere. That's powerful and profound stuff. In fact, on the next slide, I want to show you how these things came true in Jesus while he's on the cross. So while he is in excruciating pain, check it out. On the cross, Jesus still yet kneeling in service to others. And so as he's up there in agony, I mean, I don't know about you, but if I'm up there in agony and completely humiliated, naked for all to see, beaten beyond recognition, I'm going to be thinking about myself. I'm going to be thinking, how much longer do I have to hang here? This is miserable. But his attitude is, who's here? Who do I need to serve right now? And he sees his mother, who's about to lose her son, her oldest son. And so he looks at her and sees John, a disciple, and says, Mom, I want you to look at that guy. I want you to look at him as your son. John, you and I are close. I want you to take my mom on as your mom. He's kneeling in service, looking after the needs of others while he's in agony. On the cross, he's still yet gracing where there is enmity. He's famous for this. The very people who orchestrated his death are spitting insults at him, ridiculing him at the foot of the cross. And while he's sitting there suffering, he is filled with grace. He's already forgiven them. And he communicates grace to them. God forgive them. They just don't know what the heck they're doing. Just forgive them, which means he'd already taken that step himself. On the cross, he was still yet connected to God in such a beautiful human way. My God, why have you forsaken me? That may not sound like something you'd want on a Hallmark card, but it actually probably should be. Because this is no whitewashed, happy days version of faith. This is a Jesus who feels completely isolated, who feels totally alone, feels like all the good in the world has just gone away, and he is experiencing the full brunt of the ugliest of humanity that there is. And he was honest about it. This is a quote from Psalm 22, by the way. But Psalm 22, toward the end, says, even though this is the way I feel, I still believe in you. I still believe you exist, and I believe you are about Easter, the resurrection, the renewal of all things, the restoration of all things. And so he is able to say before his last breath, into your hands I commit my spirit. And on the cross, he's even incarnate. He's with and for people, even to the very end. So there's a criminal right behind him who's also dying on a cross. And this guy is having a moment. I'm about to die. And he's freaking out. And he's heard enough about Jesus and seen enough about him to know that something else is going on in this Jesus. And he makes a statement of faith. He says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says these words to this guy, joining him in his pain and agony. Even as he's agonizing, he joins him in that space, comes alongside and says, today you will be with me in paradise. Giving hope to a person who he could have just dismissed. This is the pattern of Jesus. The very cross that he's on is the pattern of Jesus, by the way, if you didn't catch that. Often we kind of over-spiritualize things when it comes to the cross. And I just want to be very matter-of-fact about it. If you're a guy walking around in ancient Israel under the occupation of Rome, and you are saying statements that are direct quotes from Caesar, except now you're twisting them around to say them about yourself or about the God of Israel, which is challenging the authority of Rome, that's going to catch up with you. You can hang out in the sticks up in Lake County for a long time, but you know that there's a price on your head. And then if you go and you're talking trash, appropriately so, to religious leaders who are using their religious authority to keep people down, and to tell them that they're no good, and to tell them they have no hope, and even extorting extra funds from them so they can live a lavish lifestyle. If you speak against them and call them out on it, call them out in completely obvious ways, like calling them to their face, you are whitewashed tombs. You are turning your disciples into twice the sons of hell that you are. That's not mincing words. That's going to catch up with you. And it's going to catch up to you the most if you go to the center of their power, which is what Jesus did. When Jesus made the choice to go into his ministry, he knew it was going to stretch him physically, emotionally, spiritually, in every way, especially when he went to Jerusalem, that final trip, because he knew it was all going to come down. And he knew, if he was paying any attention at all, that when you say words of insurrection against Rome, that there is one fate that awaits you, and that's a cross. And he was okay with it. He was okay being silent. He was okay being quiet, because he knew that the God that is trying to restore and renew all things is not a God who comes with a lightning bolt that's just going to wipe out the people in one fell swoop who he doesn't like and didn't do the right thing. That's not the character and nature of God. And so he goes the way of the servant. He becomes the suffering servant, like the entire nation of Israel was hundreds of years before. He takes on the cross. But you know, Jesus wasn't the only one who experienced a cross. Jesus was one significant one. We're all here because of him. But after Jesus, other people heard the same Easter song, the same call to renewal, the same call to do it in a nonviolent kind of way. I have a clip from a video coming up on the next slide, and it's actually from the movie Gandhi, 30, 20 years ago, whatever it was, in the early 80s. And it's kind of hard to hear it, so we're going to crank the volume a little bit, but just to set the context so you know what's going on, is the first people who are there with Gandhi, who is very, very famous and very much loved by the people of India. The way that he learned to get them to do things was not to beat them with an iron fist or to make threats against them, but to do a different thing. He'd stop eating. He'd go on a fast. And he would leverage his popularity and the love of his people for him to exact change in them. So this is toward the end of Gandhi's life. And he hasn't eaten for a long time. And the first people you see are militants who want to take Great Britain by the horns and slaughter them and get them out of there. And they are coming before Gandhi, dropping their swords. And then you're going to see a guy show up. And in case you don't hear it, this is a guy who is absolutely tormented by grief, who sees Gandhi as his hope and the hope of his people. And he's tormented by grief because he killed a child, a Muslim child. And he killed a Muslim child because it was a Muslim gang that killed his child. And so Gandhi offers an interesting transaction to get him out of his hell. Let's check it out.
We stop Hindu swords. It's a promise. Go. God be with you. Here, eat. Eat. I'm going to hell, but not with your death on my soul.
Only God decides who goes to hell.
I killed a child. I smashed his head against a wall.
Why?
They killed my son. My boy. The Muslims killed my son.
I know a way out of hell. Find a child whose mother and father have been killed. A little boy or boy, listen high, and raise him as your own. Only be sure that he is a Muslim, and that you raise him as one.
So Gandhi knew that there was an option. He knew that if he wanted to see real change happen in India, it was going to be a choice, and that choice was going to stretch him. It was going to stretch him again and again and again. And my hunch is, in fact, I'm certain of it, that you're going to see these same kind of markers, kneeling, gracing, connecting, incarnating, happen in his life as well, because this is the pattern. This is the pattern. You want Easter, you want resurrection. It's going to come with a choice and a stretch, and your life is going to be modeled very similarly to the foot of Jesus. You're going to find yourself kneeling where you wouldn't have before, offering forgiveness and grace where you wouldn't before, connecting with God because you know you absolutely have to have it. And you're going to find yourself even being with people that you wouldn't expect yourself to be. It's not going to be just Facebook friends, but this is a different level of intimacy and strength. MLK was the same way. Both men, by the way, Gandhi and MLK, had their skeletons in their closet, I'm sure. But don't let that distract you from the greater thing that they were about, a choice and a stretch that has to come before Easter. So this is kind of leading to some questions for you. What does your call to Easter look like? What's your Easter? And my hint for you is that it probably has something to do with your passion, something that's very important to you. That the thing you want to see restoration or renewal in is probably tied into something about you. And just a reminder that if you choose to pursue Easter, whatever that is at this moment, if it's a interpersonal, community, or global kind of thing, it's going to come with not just a choice, but a stretch. And this is an ancient call. In fact, Jesus made this similar call to his disciples a long time ago. On the next screen, we see it. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me." In other words, it's not going to be easy. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your own soul, your own essence, who you really are, your true self that God has created you to be? That's what you're supposed to be. The Message version in the same passage says it a little differently. Then Jesus went to work on his disciples. Anyone who intends to come with me toward Easter has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat, I am. Don't run from suffering, embrace it. Follow me and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to finding yourself, your true self. What kind of deal is it to get everything you want but lose yourself? What could you ever trade your soul for? Now, I hope, if you're paying any attention at all, that you understand that what Jesus is calling for here, and really what God has been about from the very beginning, is crazy countercultural and crazy counterintuitive. That this is not for the faint of heart. This is not cheap grace. This is not an easy ride. But it's a cross. And Jesus is inviting you and me to pick it up, which is a choice and is a stretch. But it's the only thing that will actually get it done. It's the only thing that will get us to Easter, to resurrection. That's just the pattern that it is. And so, I wish I could give you some kind of health and wealth cheap gospel that just says if you say the magic words or do the right thing, it's all going to get better. And for some of you it might. But if you really want to see Easter happen, if you really want to see the resurrection happen, if you want to see renewal, restoration, it's in the form of a cross. It is cruciform. It's not easy. And when Jesus said stuff like this, he lost his crowds. He would go from thousands of people listening to him, and he'd say some crazy stuff like this, like, well, okay, this is really the way to life. It's a choice and it's a stretch, and it's going to mean different things for how we choose to live out our lives. And as soon as he would say that, most of the people would hear it and say, I'll pass. Thanks anyway. We'll see you next round. See you next Easter. Right? That's kind of how it would usually go. But a few caught it. A few recognized the greater implications. A few who couldn't recognize Jesus because he was so beaten on the cross, when they saw the resurrected Jesus, and he was new, fresh, different, totally new, totally different, and they recognized that that is a sign for everything, not just one thing, they were captured by it. And they boldly and confidently took up their cross of choice and let it take them where they needed to go, which was always a stretch. So my last question for you on the last slide. Just to recap, God is always about getting to Easter. It's what God wants to do, and God is always calling people to get in on the ride. He's calling you to do that. And that call carries a choice and a stretch, which is in the shape of a cross. The real question for you is, where are you in this process? What's next for you? What's your Easter? What's the choice? What's the stretch? And what's next? Because if you want to see Easter, this is where you got to go. Let's pray together. God, somebody smart once said, if it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be worth doing. And that could not be more true than with the most important things of life. The areas of our greatest pain, the areas of our world's greatest suffering are enormous challenges that require a whole different mindset, a whole different way of being, which we have now seen modeled in Jesus and people like him before him and people who followed in a similar vein, singing the same song after him, but we so see it in Jesus. And so when he extends that invitation to us to pick up the cross I wonder, God, what that means to us, to a person. So God, maybe here today, maybe there's somebody who has, some deeper inner stuff that needs to be dealt with. And it is easier to just put a Band-Aid on it and keep going through the day, but that's not Easter. And so your call is to go after that, which is a choice. And it's a hard choice because it's going to lead to some stretching, some pulling off the Band-Aid. And for some of us, that Band-Aid isn't covering a personal wound, it's covering a relational wound. And we'd rather just keep sweeping stuff under the rug, but that's not Easter. That's not resurrection. That's comfort, and it's a lie. That's not life, it's death. And so maybe today, your call is for us to really make a choice for health in that relationship and do whatever we got to do in terms of stretching to pursue Easter. Because the resurrection of that relationship isn't going to happen apart from the cross. And on massive issues that our country faces, that we want to use bumper sticker politics on to make it all better, it's a bunch of baloney, God. Help us realize that the way to solution, the way to the resurrection of all things, the way to renewal for all people everywhere at all times forevermore, comes in the shape of the cross. A choice and a stretch that is difficult, that requires you. That requires an emotional stretch, a physical stretch, a spiritual stretch, maybe even a stretch of our wallets. Easter is before us. May you help us recognize what it means. And may you give us the courage to make the choice to pursue it. And the capacity to stretch. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.